It was the fall of 1983, a grey morning in Arlington, and I was standing outside the cemetery gates like a man who'd never existed. My shoes were scuffed, the soles thin from years of walking without purpose, and my coat hung on me like a flag no one saluted anymore. The guards at the entrance didn't ask for ID, didn't need to. One glance at me, and they made it clear I wasn't welcome. Maybe it was the threadbare uniform jacket, maybe the face they thought didn't belong among heroes, but they looked right through me, like I was just another old vet, wandering too close to ceremony. Back in '68, they used to call me Captain Jack Harrell, Echo Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. I led men through jungles soaked in fear and heat, saw brothers fall face first into rice paddies, held radios heavy with static and death. Now they called me nothing, just a man too late, too quiet, too forgotten to count. I didn't come for recognition. I didn't come for glory. I came because the man being buried that day, Brigadier General Thomas R. Mallory, had once pulled me from a downed Huey, dragged me across 200 meters of hell, and said, with blood pouring down his cheek, "You're not dying on me, Harrell. Not today." I owed him more than my life. I owed him the truth, the kind only one man could bring to a grave. But I was left standing outside those iron gates, watching the honor guard line up, the rifles polished, the flag folded, and feeling like my soul had been dismissed. As I turned to leave, heart bitter, eyes burning, hand clenching the crumpled letter I'd written to his widow, something cold and round slipped from my coat pocket. It hit the pavement with a sound too sharp to ignore. The bronze star, the one Mallory himself had pinned to my chest when no one else had the courage to acknowledge what had happened in that field near Khe Sanh. A boy, couldn't have been older than 10, stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers. He bent down, picked up the medal, and looked at me like I was someone. "Is this yours, sir?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I didn't know, but because no one had called me sir in over a decade. And just as I took a breath to speak, a voice from inside the gates cut through the murmur of ceremony, a firm, commanding voice, one I hadn't heard in years. "Jack Harrell," it called. I looked up, and what happened next changed everything. If this story moves you like it moved me to write it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, break hearts, and bring hope. And now, get ready, because what happened next will change everything. After I came home from Vietnam, nothing looked the same. Not the streets of Virginia, not the faces at the bus station, not even my own reflection in the bar window across from the Greyhound depot. I stepped off that bus in late September of 1971, my sea bag over my shoulder and a folded discharge paper in my pocket, expecting foolishly that there'd be someone waiting. But there was no welcome home, no parades, no handshakes, just a few sideways glances from people who didn't want to know where I'd been. And in that silence, I learned the first rule of post-war America: speak softly or not at all. Back in country, I'd been someone. Captain Jack Harrell, the guy who kept his platoon moving when the trail was mined, who called in air support under fire, who buried more friends than anyone should by 30. I wore that rank like a shield, even when I didn't believe I deserved it. I wrote letters for my men, patched wounds I had no training to treat, pulled them back from the edge when the jungle tried to swallow us whole. I was a leader. Not perfect, not fearless, but responsible. That meant something over there. But when I came home, that name, that rank, meant nothing. All anyone seemed to see was the war, not the men, not the loss, not the choices we never asked to make. In job interviews, I watched eyes narrow the moment they read Vietnam. They'd thank me for my service, then slide my resume aside like it carried something contagious. I didn't even get a second interview at the county fire department. Too much baggage, someone said off the record. Too rigid, probably got a temper. What they didn't know was that I'd already been living in silence long before the rejection letters came. I'd stopped telling stories, even to myself. I folded my uniforms and packed them in a box, shoved it to the back of a closet I couldn't afford to fill. The Bronze Star, the one General Mallory had pinned to me during the monsoon season of '69, his own hands shaking from fever, stayed tucked in a sock drawer, far from sight. I didn't wear it. I didn't talk about it, because what was the point? People didn't want heroes from that war. They wanted to forget it ever happened. I tried to make a life, I really did. I picked up shifts at a machine shop outside Roanoke, kept my head down, never talked politics, never mentioned the war unless someone else brought it up first. And even then, I kept it vague. I was in the Marines, I'd say. And if they asked where, I'd shrug. Out east. And let them think Okinawa or Korea or anywhere else but that hellhole of headlines and nightmares. I rented a room above a diner, lived on coffee and cigarettes, sent my mom $50 a month when I could. I never married, not because I didn't want to. God knows I did. Her name was Ellen Carter. She wrote me letters the whole time I was overseas, waited 2.5 years while I slept in mud, and carried her picture in the inside flap of my helmet liner. I proposed in one of my last letters home before the Tet Offensive changed everything. She said yes, but I came back too late. I found out from her sister Ellen had died in a car accident just 3 weeks before my return. Hit by a drunk driver on Route 29. I missed her funeral by 6 days. After that, I stopped going home. There was nothing there but echoes and a headstone I couldn't bring myself to visit. I stayed in towns where no one knew my name, kept moving every time someone started asking too many questions, like maybe I was hiding something, and maybe I was. Maybe it wasn't guilt or shame. Maybe it was just exhaustion from trying to explain what it felt like to pull a 17-year-old radio operator's body out of a creek, still warm, and realize you'd been calling his name for the last 10 minutes without noticing he wasn't answering. From waking up every night for a decade at exactly 2:37 a.m. When the moment the Claymore went off outside our camp perimeter in Quang Tri, and half my squad never got out of their bunks, I learned to carry it quietly. That's what we all did, the ones who made it back. We kept our war in our bones and in the lines on our faces, in the way we walked past 4th of July parades without stopping, in the way we stood too stiff in elevators, in the way our hands curled when someone slammed a door too hard. By 1983, I was living out of my truck, parked 2 blocks from the VFW that never returned my calls. I kept my jacket clean, my boots polished, but nobody cared. People saw an old man and kept walking. They didn't see the ribbons, the scars, or the weight I still carried from a field on the far side of the Pacific. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. Just tired. Tired of not being seen. Tired of holding stories that no one wanted to hear. Tired of being the last one left who remembered their names. Until that boy picked up my medal, and for the first time in a very, very long time, someone looked at me like I still mattered. The Bronze Star had lived in my coat pocket for years, not on display, not worn, just there, tucked away like a memory I couldn't bring myself to bury. I carried it the way some men carry grief, quietly, always. It was the only thing I had left from a war that had taken everything else, my friends, my peace, my future. I didn't carry it for pride. I carried it so I wouldn't forget I'd been someone once, someone who mattered, someone who came home with something to show for it, even if no one ever asked to see it. I never meant for it to fall out of my coat that morning. Never meant for it to hit the sidewalk in front of Arlington Cemetery like some discarded trinket. But maybe that's how the past works. It finds a way to make itself known, even when we've spent decades trying to hide it. I heard the sound before I saw it. That sharp clink of metal against pavement, crisp and final. I froze. The honor guard across the lawn was preparing the flag, folding it with the precision only Marines understand. A bugler stood to the side, trumpet resting against his chest. Mourners were gathering, suits pressed, shoes polished, as if they could bury their grief under good tailoring. I wasn't one of them. I was the man they told to step aside at the gate, the man whose name wasn't on the list, whose history wasn't welcome, even if the man in that casket had once saved my life. And then I saw him. He couldn't have been older than 10. Baseball cap turned backward, a little too big for his head, scuffed sneakers, chocolate smudged on one cheek. He broke from the small crowd of civilians, the ones watching from beyond the fence, and stepped toward the spot where the medal had landed. His hand reached out before I could say anything. He picked it up carefully, like it was made of glass instead of tarnished brass, and turned to me with a look that was far too serious for a boy that young. "Was this yours, sir?" His voice was soft but clear, unafraid. That last word, sir, hit harder than the metal on the ground. It had been so long since anyone had called me that, so long since I'd been addressed like someone who'd worn a uniform for something other than charity or shame. I looked down at him, unable to answer at first. My throat tightened. My chest felt hollow and full all at once, like the war had just stepped out of my memories and stood between us. He kept holding the medal up, his small fingers gripping the ribbon like it meant something, like he knew it meant something, even if he didn't understand what. Behind him, I noticed a man approaching, tall, lean, maybe mid-40s. He moved with purpose, a quiet urgency in his stride. At first, I thought he was there to take the boy away, apologize on his behalf, maybe tell me something polite but dismissive. But as he got closer, his expression changed. His eyes weren't filled with discomfort or disdain. They were focused, calculating, like he was placing me somewhere in his memory. He glanced at the medal, still in the boy's hand, and then looked at me. "Captain Harrell?" he asked. That name, I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Not since the VA offices stopped sending letters. Not since the last Marine I knew passed away in a rehab center outside Baltimore. I nodded, cautious, unsure of what was happening. He stepped closer. "Colonel Mark Taylor. I served under General Mallory back in '71. You were Echo Company, right? You were the one they said he pulled from the wreckage after that LZ went hot near Cam Low." I blinked, stunned. The moment hit me like a second explosion. Not violent, but just as disorienting. This man, this colonel, remembered. He knew. Not from a file, not from a news article, but from service. From being there. From the mud, the sweat, the fear. From then. "Yes," I said quietly. "That was me." He turned to the guards at the gate and without hesitation said, "Let him in." They hesitated, glanced at each other, and then stepped aside. Just like that. The colonel looked back at me. "General Mallory always spoke about you, said you saved him first, but he never got to say it properly. He said if anyone ever showed up at his funeral without an invitation and they looked like they'd walked through hell to get there, we were to let them in." I wanted to say something, anything, but words failed me. All I could do was nod as he gently motioned me forward. The boy stepped aside, placing the medal back in my palm. His eyes didn't look away. "You really knew the general." I crouched down, my knees creaking, and met his gaze. "He was the bravest man I ever met," I said, "and he saved my life." The boy smiled softly, then returned to his place beside the civilians. The colonel waited, walking beside me as we stepped through the gates I thought I'd never cross. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't invisible. After the funeral, I didn't leave right away. Most people did. They shook hands, offered condolences, and drifted back to their cars like smoke after a fire. But I stayed. I stood beneath a tree just beyond the rows of white headstones, watching the honor guard carry General Mallory's casket away, wondering how a man who'd meant so much to so many could be laid to rest in just a few minutes. How a life like that could be folded into silence, into flag and formality. It felt too small, too brief, too clean. Colonel Taylor walked up beside me. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a folded envelope. The paper was yellowing, worn at the creases like it had been opened and closed too many times. My name was written on it in a sharp, careful hand. "Mallory gave me this a long time ago," Taylor said. "Told me to deliver it to you if I ever crossed your path again. Said it was something he didn't know how to say face to face." I took the envelope with hands that didn't feel like mine. Inside was a letter, written in 1974. It was short, direct, like the man himself. He thanked me, said I saved him twice. Once on the field, and once after, when I wrote a report that cleared him of a friendly fire incident that would have ended his career. He didn't mention the details, but I remembered them. I remembered everything. The letter ended with a single line I've read 100 times since. "Jack, if you ever come back, know this. Not all debts are paid with medals. Some are paid with memory." That night, I couldn't sleep. I was back in my truck, parked behind a diner off Route 50, the letter folded in my lap. The medal sat on the dashboard, catching light from the blinking neon sign above the window. Open 24 hours. I looked at it and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, but something close, a kind of belonging, like maybe I hadn't been erased after all. The next morning, I drove back to Taylor's office. He was stationed at the Pentagon now, just a few miles from where I'd once trained green recruits on how to read topographic maps and navigate jungle terrain. He welcomed me in like I was an old friend. "I want to show you something," he said. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small box, beat up, taped shut, labeled in faded black ink. "Harrell, returned mail." Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me, postmarked between 1969 and 1971. Most were from one person, Ellen Carter. I stared at them like they were ghosts. "I don't understand," I said. "I never got these." "They were sent to the wrong forward address," he explained. "We didn't find them until after you were listed as MIA. Nobody knew where to send them after that." My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat. I picked one at random, opened it, and read the first line. "Jack, I don't know if this will reach you, but I have to try, because I have something to tell you, something important." I read the rest of that letter with shaking hands. Ellen was pregnant, and I'd never known. Letter after letter told the story. She'd kept writing even after I stopped answering. She'd tried everything to find me, even after I came home and disappeared into myself. She hadn't just waited. She'd reached out into the darkness, hoping I'd be there on the other side. And I hadn't been. I sat in that office for what felt like hours, reading, rereading, letting the truth settle in my bones like winter. At some point, Taylor put a hand on my shoulder and said, "There's more." He handed me a photo. A young man, early 20s, standing in front of a truck with a military license plate. He looked like Ellen. Same eyes, same jaw, but there was something else. A certain tilt to the shoulders. A kind of weight in the gaze that I recognized instantly. His name was James Carter, raised in Richmond, joined the army, served in Desert Storm, now worked at a mechanic shop just outside Fredericksburg. "He's your son," Taylor said. I don't remember how I got back to my truck, or how long I sat there staring at the photo. But I remember thinking, not about what I'd missed, but about what might still be possible, what could be reclaimed even now. I wrote James a letter that night. I didn't know what to say. I started it 3 times, tore up 2 drafts. In the end, I kept it simple. "My name is Jack Harrell. I served with your mother's fiancé in Vietnam. I believe I may be your father. I would very much like to meet you, if that's something you'd want." I mailed it the next morning, and then I waited. For the first time in years, I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding behind silence or shame. I was just waiting, like a man with a future, not just a past. I waited nearly 2 weeks before the letter came. It was a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name written in tight, careful handwriting that made me nervous to open it. Not because I feared rejection, but because I didn't know what kind of man would be waiting on the other side of the words. Would he be angry? Would he even believe me? Would he care at all? The note inside was short, just a few lines. "Mr. Harrell, I got your letter. I've known for a long time that my mum's fiancé was MIA in Vietnam and that she never stopped hoping he'd come back. She never talked about him much, said it hurt too much. But I always wondered. I'm willing to meet. Friday, at Dean's Auto, after 6. James." That Friday, I shaved. I cleaned the collar of my old Marine dress shirt, the one that hadn't seen daylight since the Nixon administration. I didn't wear the medals, just the ribbon pins, faded and quiet. I wanted him to see the man, not the uniform. I wanted him to see who I was now, not just what I'd survived. Dean's Auto was tucked off a county road near Fredericksburg. Cinder block building, rusted sign, smell of oil and summer heat rising off the gravel lot. I pulled up in my truck, heart pounding, palms sweating, and sat there with the engine running until I realized I couldn't put it off any longer. When I stepped inside, the bell over the door gave a tired jingle. He was there, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag, leaning against a tool chest. The moment our eyes met, I knew. I didn't need a blood test or a birth certificate. I could see myself in him, not just in the jawline or the slope of his shoulders, but in the way he stood, like he was bracing for something he didn't know how to face. "James?" I asked. He nodded. "You must be Jack." We stood there in the quiet for a moment, two men caught between decades, strangers tethered by blood and loss. He motioned toward the office in the back, and we sat down across from each other at a dented metal desk, surrounded by invoices and parts catalogs and the smell of rubber and rust. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. He gave a half smile. "Me either, but somehow we did." He told me about growing up, how his mother never remarried, how she worked nights at the hospital and always kept a framed photo of a young Marine on her nightstand. He told me she never confirmed it, but that he always suspected the man in the photo wasn't just her fiancé, that there was something more, something unspoken. I told him about Vietnam, not everything, not all at once, but enough. About the firefights, the letters, the hole I fell into when I thought I'd lost Ellen. About the decades I spent moving from one job to another, from one borrowed room to the next, never settling, never speaking, just carrying her memory in silence. He listened, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet dignity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like a man, not just a veteran, not just a ghost. At one point I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out one of Ellen's letters. The first one where she mentioned him, the one I'd read so many times the folds were nearly worn through. I handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly, read it in silence. When he reached the end, his fingers trembled. "I've never seen her handwriting before," he whispered. "That undid me." I looked away, blinking fast, but it was too late. The tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just the slow, aching kind that carry the weight of years. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just reached across the table and rested his hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. We talked until the shop lights dimmed and the street outside was bathed in the gold of late summer dusk. He asked if I had somewhere to stay. I told him I'd been staying in my truck, but that I'd been thinking of heading back west. "Why don't you stay here a while?" he said. I looked at him unsure. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "You're not a stranger. You're family. Maybe we can start with that." So I stayed. Not just for the night, not just for the weekend, but for good. He cleared out a room in the back of the house he rented behind the shop, told his kids, my grandkids, that their grandfather had been away for a very long time, but he was here now, and he had some stories to tell. And I did. Every night, they'd gather around the kitchen table and ask me about the war, about the letters, about their grandmother. And I told them, gently, honestly, always trying to balance the truth with tenderness. I didn't glorify the war. I didn't downplay it either. I told them about courage and loss and love that lasted beyond the silence. One night, James stayed behind after the kids went to bed. We sat with 2 mugs of black coffee, the house quiet. He looked at me and said, "You didn't have to come. Most people wouldn't have, but you did, and I'm glad." I looked back at him, heart full in a way I didn't know was possible anymore. "I spent half my life waiting for someone to tell me I still mattered," I said. "And somehow you just did." The bronze star doesn't sit in my coat pocket anymore. It hangs on the wall now, framed in a shadow box beside a black and white photo of me in uniform, and another one, newer, brighter, of James and his kids standing next to me outside Dean's Auto, all of us squinting into the sun. Above it, Ellen's handwriting, pulled from one of her last letters, printed in soft gold lettering. "You're still in the world. I'll always believe that." That's what the medal means to me now. Not the action it was given for, not the firefight in some forgotten jungle clearing, not the shouts and smoke and blood, but what came after, the chance to matter again. The quiet dignity of being remembered not just by rank or role or uniform, but as a father, a man, a human being who got lost for a while and somehow found his way back. I still go to the cemetery sometimes, not just for Mallory, but for the men whose names live only on those marble stones, men who never got to come home, or who came home in pieces no one could put back together. I walk past the headstones and run my fingers along the engraved names, not because I knew them all, but because I could have been any one of them. Sometimes James comes with me. Sometimes he brings his daughter, and when she asks who these people are, I tell her. They were the kind of people who stood up when it mattered. They were the kind who remembered each other. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not the ribbons, not the citations, but the stories we tell when someone finally asks the right question. The kind that gets passed down around kitchen tables and through the letters we were too scared to send. For years, I thought silence was strength, that holding it all in, the pain, the loss, the memories, was how you survived. But it turns out the real strength is in telling the truth, in opening the box, in reading the letter, in saying, yes, that medal was mine. And now, when strangers pass me by, sometimes they stop, not because of the uniform, but because James told the town my story, because his kids brought me to school on Veterans Day and asked me to speak, because someone finally saw something worth remembering. The other day, a boy, maybe the same age James's son was when we met, stopped me outside the grocery store. He pointed at the ribbon pin on my jacket. "Were you in a war?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, a long one." "Did you win?" he said. I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said, "but I lived." He seemed confused by that. But one day, maybe he'll understand. I used to think the war had taken everything, my youth, my love, my place in the world. But now I see it gave me something too, not in the moment, but over time. It gave me a story, a son, a second chance, and sometimes that's enough. We share new stories every day, true stories that inspire and stay with you.